companies that have left so far, Chevron, Exxon, Shell, BP, they were the ones who were responsible for bringing this stuff online. So even if nothing else went wrong and the oil kept flowing, you'd still be looking at a 50% reduction in output over the next few years because the Russians can't maintain this stuff. And every Russian bond and stock is going to go to zero, which is how things worked before globalization in a situation like this. There's plenty of historical precedent. The Russians are going to nationalize everything. And you're going to have to wait to start over with a fundamentally new government that has a different understanding of national authority and rule of law. So you have to wait for Putin to be removed from the scene one way or another, and the entire power cadre that he has spent the last 25 years building to also dissolve into something else. That is not a 5-year bet. Yeah, so there's two groups of oligarchs. You've got the ones that stole from Russia in the 1990s. Putin tamed all of those in the first half of the 2000s. And some of them are now the ones that are saying things against the war from outside of Russia. Going after their assets is all well and good. They started out as crooks. Some of them kind of reformed themselves. That's a personal or political preference. I don't think there'd be any blowback from going after those guys. The second group are called the Silivarks. They're people who came up with Putin from the security apparatus who then have seized other things. They are absolutely economically incompetent. And I heartily encourage everybody goes after those people's things. If you have assets in Russia, and you haven't written it down to zero, I'm kind of wondering what you're waiting for. Because no one's getting any of that out. As for US or EU property in Europe, that's going to be so minor, it's not going to move the needle in terms of decision making in any capital. So that's a great question. Whether Putin will survive, I don't know. People in this part of the world tend to slip in the shower and fall in some bullets from time to time. It's entirely possible that'll happen to him. I have no inside information on that side. He's done a really good job of kind of consolidating his control of the system. So I don't think that's a high risk for him. Where was I going with this?
The people.
Russia is a very large food exporter. The big problem is that they do a lot of wheat, they do some potatoes, the stuff you can do in cold climates, and they import everything else. So the import-export is over. So they're back to kind of a monochromatic, high-saturated fat diet. This is one of the reasons why Russia and China are duking it out for the world's worst demography. We know based on the demographics, they will not survive this century. The question is, how fast do they fade from the world? I don't expect Russia to have meaningful food shortages in terms of starvation. There will always be a distribution issue. And with every company that deals with the logistics or tech that pulls out of Russia, the distribution becomes a little bit more old school. So growing the food, I'm not concerned about. Distributing it in a way that keeps everybody alive, that's a different question. In terms of war deaths, even if this turns out to a really brutal, grinding World War II style house-to-house obliteration, you're probably looking at fewer than 1 million Russians dying. That's a lot. It's all concentrated in the young age group, but it's all dudes. And as Russia has shown, you can lose 15% of your male population of an age bracket and still limp on. I think the bigger problem overall is the outmigration. In the 1990s, based on whose numbers you're looking, the Russians lost between 2 and 10 million people to outward migration. We're now having a second wave. Everyone who grew up under Putin, who is now in their 20s, are seeing everything that they thought that Putin gave them in terms of stability and economic growth dissolve in literally days. And anyone who can get out is getting out, and they're taking their skills with them. And the Russian educational system really collapsed in mass back in the 80s and was never reformed. So these people are irreplaceable. Sure. So assuming for the moment that the Russian gambit to split off Turkey and Germany works, because if it doesn't, then NATO's a very different place. But let's assume that that works. In that specific scenario, the Americans would be unlikely to function because they need those bases in Turkey and Germany in order to forward project into these countries. However, if we get to that point, I think that the violence would be significantly worse and the damage to civilian infrastructure wouldn't be incidental, it would be very deliberate. The Russians have been agitating against these countries since the Soviet Union fell. And while there are a lot of people in Russia who see Ukrainians as brothers and sisters and cousins, there's no one in Russia who's like, oh yeah, I just want to go and hug a Pole. So just the obliteration level of artillery use that we would see in places like Warsaw and Riga, we really have not seen that anywhere in the world except Grozny since World War II. Right now, the NATO policy, and I think this will stick as long as the Ukraine war is going on, is to shove as many weapons and as much intelligence and maybe volunteers into Ukraine as possible, so that the Russians have to fight for every bloody inch, and then when they're done, they have to go back and do it all over because there's a partisan insurrection. Because as long as Russia is bleeding in Ukraine, they don't have a free hand to do what's next. And I think there's a recognition now in NATO capitals that this is not just about the separatist regions in Crimea and Kiev, that this is about going for the whole enchilada while the Russians still can. And so anything you can do to keep the Russians in Ukraine is a win. I agree with about half of that. On supply chain, certainly, between the shale revolution, COVID, populism, anti-trade, Trump, Biden, all of that combined, there is now not a manufacturing process in East Asia that can be done more cheaply than its equivalent in North America. You just have to build the industrial plant first. And I realize that takes years based on the sector. So the US right now is going through its fastest industrialization ever, even faster than what we did during World War II. And this is only going to accelerate that entire process as we basically draw a big, thick line between the North American system and this China-centric system. And since the United States system has Mexico and has the consumption and China does not, that ends with China being removed as a significant manufacturing player, assuming it doesn't collapse on its own first. Roughly our industrial plant. In terms of energy, there's going to be a whole mix of things in there. As long as Biden does not does not reinstate the US energy export embargo, you're going to see a huge expansion of drilling, because you're talking about feeding into a system that's at least 5 million barrels per day shy. If prices stay under 170 in that environment, I would be shocked. But Biden is also a populist. There is no way that he or Trump or Obama would expose the American population to $200 oil if he didn't have to. And he doesn't have to, because in the 2015 omnibus bill, the president has the ability to slam the export ban back into place at any time without needing to go to Congress first. So one way or another, the world is not just losing Russian crude, it's also losing American crude.
Do you expect that to happen, the export ban?
This year. People in their 40s and 50s are the savers. They're the high productive workers. They don't consume much. That's Europe. People in their 20s and the 30s, they're the low-end workers. They're the consumers. That's maybe the Middle East. And people who are in their 10s and their single digits, they're the children. They're the workers of tomorrow. No one has children except for the United States, Mexico, France, and New Zealand.
United States, Mexico, France, and New Zealand.
Most advanced countries, and especially countries that are rapidly industrialized like China and Korea, they're already into that near retiree bracket. So we know that we're facing population collapses in a number of major economies, first and foremost China, because they stopped having kids in number 40 years ago.
What about India? What about Africa?
India is more like Mexico in that it's slowed down, but there's still decades left ahead of them. The problem with Africa is that they are such a huge importer of all the things that is necessary to maintain modern life, most notably agriculture, that if you break down global supply chains, a lot of these countries are going to dissolve.
What about Latin America?
Latin America is a pretty good spot. They've industrialized a little late and they've urbanized even later, but as a rule, they're kind of like a step behind Mexico in terms of the health of their demography. There's no country in Latin America that I'm overly concerned about, except for, of course, Venezuela, which has committed suicide.